In this presentation, we will do calculations related to the contribution margin. We're going to start with Excel. I do recommend putting this information into Excel even if you're going to be doing tests by hand because you want to practice putting this information into tables. Excel really helps to move this information around. Obviously, we will be using Excel most of the time in practice as well as opposed to paper and pencil. We're going to give you an Excel worksheet that you can enter this information into, but we also want to practice just setting up the tables in Excel with something like the contribution margin. Therefore, we're going to start with a blank sheet here and go through the formatting of it. I'll go through it pretty quickly. This isn't going to be an Excel course, but we want to get an idea of setting this information up. I'm going to open up Excel. This is going to be our information that we're going to be using to populate it on the right. Normally, the first thing I do when opening Excel is I'll highlight the entire worksheet by hitting this triangle. I'm going to right-click and format the cells. And I typically start off with formatting as simply as possible. If I can remove the decimals, I will. I'll go to currency. I like to have the brackets personally around for negative numbers. And then remove the dollar sign. We don't need it. And I'm going to remove the decimals. This is my default type of position that I would go into and say OK. And then I'll usually make it a little bit larger in the zoom. I'm going to make it like 140 for now, and we'll start there. I'm going to label the worksheet. I'm going to say contribution margin. And then, of course, normally I would save it from this point. We might want to actually say what the worksheet is or create a style for the worksheet. I usually would go then to the Home tab, Styles, and then go to the Cell Styles and just make a title style. Or you can just bold it and make it large. That's usually where I would start. Now, any type of contribution margin type of problem that you'll see, or if you're doing this in real life, of course, you're going to want to set up at the top of the worksheet all of your data. What you want to do is be able to refer to this data at the top with formulas, and that allows you to have the flexibility to run estimates. So if you see a problem that has a bunch of a paragraph of stuff, you want to pull out the relevant stuff and put it at the top of your worksheet. If you're working in real life, then of course you want to start your worksheet with the relevant data at the top. Therefore, I'm going to make this cell a little bit larger so we can do that. I've already pulled out the relevant data here, so I'm just going to add that. But if it was in a paragraph format, the problem, then make sure that you put it in some format that you can reference to and reference the cell to in Excel. So I'm just going to say, all right, we have the units, and that's 100. We've got the sales. That's going to be the 57. Total sales, and then we've got the variable costs, and that's going to be the 3021, and then we've got the fixed costs, and that's going to be the 153,900, and the target income, which we're going to say is 100,000. So that's just data that's going to be given within the problem. I'm going to list it up here. Notice I'm going to list the description and then give the number in a separate cell because I want to be able to refer to them in formulas. Note with this type of problem, you're going to want to differentiate the items that are units from the items that are dollars. And you might actually want to take the time to go in here and differentiate that with the use of dollar signs. So I might go in here and actually change these. These are all dollar related items by right-clicking, formatting the cell, and I'm going to say I want to make those dollars. So I'm going to add, I'm going to make it currency and add the dollar sign. So there is that. I'll make this a little bit larger so we can see it. And then we can, sometimes people like to put boxes around things. So we're going to go to the Home tab, font, and I'm going to put borders around the whole thing. So that's going to be our data, kind of defines it more. Sometimes I like to work the whole worksheet in bold as well. So I'll highlight the whole thing and just bold the whole thing so I can see it a little bit easier. And then we're going to go down here and we're going to do some of our calculations. First, we're going to discuss the contribution margin, standard kind of calculation that we would be asked. So we have the contribution margin. Now, when we consider the contribution margin, we're usually considering the contribution margin total, the contribution margin per unit, or the contribution margin percent. You want to just be used to putting this information all in one kind of worksheet. So I want to be able to just line these up side by side. This is the format I would practice doing. Any problem that you have, I don't care what it asks for, contribution margin percent, contribution margin per unit, you might as well just line them all up. It doesn't take much time in a similar format such as this. So I'm gonna start with the total here. So we're gonna say the total, and that's gonna be the total amounts, and we'll start with sales. And the sales, again, are right up top. So I'm going to pull this down with a formula now. I'm going to say this equals the sales amount, and then I'm going to have the variable costs. And I'm just going to say this equals, go into the variable costs, and then the contribution margin is here. So contribution margin is sales minus variable costs. Again, you could think of it as the top of that contribution margin type of income statement, but it's not like a normal income statement because we would have sales minus cost of goods sold. Variable costs are not the same thing. They're grouped by behavior. So just that's going to be the difference. We're going to say this is the 5.7 minus the 3,021. So there is our contribution margin. Now what we can do from that is we can get the contribution margin per unit, and we can also get the contribution margin percentages. If this is the only data that's given to you and they ask for the percentages, then we can calculate the percentages based on this. And that's what we'll do now. So I'll do that, and then we'll take a look at the contribution margin per unit because some problems give that as the only data. So here I'm going to say, okay, here's the total, and then I'm going to calculate the contribution margin percentage. So I'm going to first do it with a decimal just so we can understand how Excel works here. And we're usually concentrating on this number down here. So we're going to say, all right, the contribution margin, it's just like when we have a kind of a vertical analysis on a profit and loss statement where we will take the gross profit divided by the sales, meaning sales is going to be the goal and we're going to compare everything else to it. Well, in this case, we have the contribution margin, which is our key number, which we're going to compare to the goal of sales, dividing problem. So we're going to say, all right, the contribution margin ratio is 2679 divided by the 5700. And that's going to be 0.47. So if I do that with a formula, it's going to equal this number divided by, with the slash, this number. And then I got to add the decimals because I removed them. I'm going to go to the Home tab, Numbers, add decimals where applicable. Now note that Excel will round. If there were more decimals, we wouldn't see them unless we added them here. So just be aware that Excel will round. You want to be aware what Excel will do. It helps in situations of rounding, but it also makes confusion from rounding when we go from book problems to Excel because we have to deal with rounding. Okay, so that's going to be the total. Now note we can do the same thing with the variable costs and compare it to sales, and it's nice to do that. A question won't typically ask for that, but we want to be able to do it because that gives us a real good concept of what this means. What is that cell doing? Well, we're going to now compare this one to sales, the variable costs, and so that's going to be, of course, the 3021 divided by the 0.47. Whoops, I multiplied, I believe. So that's going to be the 3021 divided by the 57, and that's going to be the 0.53. So let's do that with a formula. This equals this number divided by this number. And then I'm going to add decimals, Home tab, Number, add decimals. And now this plus this, notice Excel does this for us, equals 1, which also is going to equal this divided by this. So in other words, if I compare sales to itself, 5.7 over 5.7 is 1, or this plus this equals 1. So that's our ratio analysis. If I go here, Home tab, Numbers, add the decimals, we've got 1. Now, if we want to move this to a percent, contribution margin percentage, then we could do this in Excel by just reformatting these cells. In other words, I'm just going to say I want these same numbers. I'm just going to take these same numbers and then just tell Excel, hey, these don't have decimals. If I had decimals, they would be the same number. And now I want to make it a percent. How would we do that mathematically? Move the decimal 2 places to the right. So we're going to go to the Home tab, Numbers, make it a percent. And there we go. It does it for us here. And so that's going to be our first type of calculation. Now we could do some formatting here. I can highlight these guys and we can underline this. We can highlight these. Home tab, font. We can maybe double underline this one. And we could oftentimes I'll make the input screens blue. So we could make that blue if we want. We can go to the Home tab, font, border it. Make this part possibly some other color. Let's make it black, white, like so. We could center these items, home, font, and center if we want to do formatting such as that. Not necessary, but we could do that. I mean, if you just put in numbers into the worksheet, you just need to set up the table. It can look a little cleaner if we have it for presentation type purposes for this information. Also note that the contribution margin here is not as accurate because we have to put something here even though we're representing the contribution margin total, the contribution margin in decimal format, and the contribution margin percent. So just be aware of that. That's just a problem with the table. I could put contribution margin, comma, contribution margin decimal, contribution margin percent, but that's quite tedious. So you're not going to see that all the time. You need to be able to understand this is the total, decimal, and percent. Now let's consider the contribution margin per unit. So we could say, all right, well, what about the contribution margin per unit? So that are going to be our next calculation. Make this a little bit larger so we can see that. Now I'll start off with the same information. I'm going to make this a little bit smaller so we can see our data up top. I'll bring this down. And we're going to say that we'll start with the same stuff. We're going to say, all right, here's our sales. We're going to say, here's our variable costs, and here's our contribution margin. Same starting point. The sales are going to be equal to this 5.7. The variable costs total are still here, and this is going to be this minus this, sales minus the variable costs. We even have the same headers, so we're going to say that's going to be the total. And then we've got the per unit, or we could say, let's say units. And now we know that the units are this 100 up top. So that's the 100. And now these all act the same because we're imagining we sell stuff. So we know that the sales, if we have earnings of 5,700, and again, it might make sense for us to use dollar signs where applicable. So if I was to make this, highlight these, and format currency dollar sign, we know that this is a dollar sign. If I format that, format currency dollar sign, and this is in units. So 100 units, 100 units. The point is that we put this in place so that they act in a similar fashion with increases or decreases with regards to units. Sales obviously does that because the sales price will remain the same. Notice the sales price wasn't given up here, but we can calculate the sales price because we're assuming that we sold all the units for the same price. So if that's the way the problem is set up, we can say, all right, well, that means that this 5,007 divided by the 100 is our sales price, right? And I'm going to make these dollar signs as well. We'll say format currency. There we go. And with the variable costs too, this is where we deviate from a CVP type analysis here from normal financial accounting where this might be cost of goods sold. We can't do this to cost of goods sold because there's fixed and variable costs in there. But here we can because these are all variable costs, and we know that if there's 3,021 and they all act the same way, they're all variable, then we can say, all right, well, that 3,021 divided by 100 units is going to be the $30.21. So $30.21. Now, if I want to take the pennies off, I'm going to round it, home tab, numbers, remove the pennies. Now, when I use a calculation, however, based on this number, it'll still have the pennies. Be aware of that. And you might say, well, why don't you just show the pennies in? And that doesn't really solve the problems because there could be hay pennies, right? We could have a number that doesn't round to 2 pennies. So there's always going to be a rounding issue, whether you round to the dollar, to the penny. It doesn't matter because Excel will show the real number is what is here. In other words, this, even though we see 30, Excel sees 3021, and that's what it'll calculate on. If it was a bigger number than that, in that it had more decimals, then Excel would still see that. We can't really remove the rounding problem, in other words. Okay, so now we can do the contribution margin, calculated 2 ways. We can say the 57 minus the variable costs is 27, or we can take this number divided by the 127. Again, there's going to be a rounding issue. So it's really 2679. So just be aware of that. I'm just going to point that out all the time. And obviously book problems will be perfect. You won't have rounding errors a lot of times, but real life will not be perfect and you'll have rounding errors. So this is the contribution margin per unit. So this contribution margin per unit, we could say something like that. Now note when you have headers that do this, you have a couple options to fix that. You can make this column wider to deal with that. You can go to the home tab, alignment, and you can wrap the text and center it, which is nice, but it messes up anything up over here because now this cell is too wide. Or you could undo. I'm going to add a cell by highlighting the entire row, right click on it, insert, and then I'm just going to put part of it up top, right? So I'm going to say contribution margin per unit. And then typically I'll center these. I'm going to center all these. And then now this looks kind of funny because it's in two cells, but if we do our kind of formatting thing and make it black and white, then it looks like it's all in one area. So we could do something like that to fix that out. Now note we could do these same percentages. A lot of times the problem will just give you the contribution margin per unit. They might not even give you the number of units and then ask you to calculate the contribution margin percent. So we can do that. Notice the percent's gonna be the same. I can calculate these percents whether you give me the totals or whether you give me the per units, because the percent is the percent. It is what it is because these ratios are the same. That's why we broke it out between variable costs and fixed costs. The ratio will be the same. Now again, we probably want decimals to see this just to make sure we get the exact percentage. So what I'm going to do is take the contribution margin, same concept here. We're going to take this idea and we're going to say, okay, it's 26.79 over the 57, that's going to be the 47. Now, note that if I removed the decimals and I said this number divided by this number, and then I added decimals here, it's going to be 47. In other words, it's still calculating as if this is the full number with the pennies. So even though I can't see the pennies, just be aware of that. So like if I saw this and I took 27 over 57, and if it came out to be something other than 47, or see how it's not exact here, I might go, it's not exact, or something's wrong, something's not happening here. Well, notice the problem isn't here, right? It's not the problem is here because it's really 26. So if I put that in the calculator, it's 0.79 over 57, you have this. Okay, those rounding errors always going to be an issue. You can't just, if I added the pennies, again, it wouldn't remove the rounding error in real life because real life numbers aren't going to be rounded to pennies. When we start dealing with ratios, it's always going to have it. And so when we have Excel, just be aware of that Excel is going to use whatever is in the cell. So if I do that here, then the variable cost is going to be the 30 over the cell, over the 57. And then I'll add the decimals there. And then these two add up to 1 or 100%. Or we could say this is this over itself. And there's the 1, right? And then we could do the same thing we did here and make it a percentage. I can say, well, if I took these same numbers, I'm going to autofill it down, autofill. And then if I took those same numbers and said, well, I could make them the same, or I make them a percent, moving the decimal 2 places to the right. Again, know what is happening here in Excel when we go Home tab, Numbers, and Percent. It moved the decimal 2 places to the right and added a percentage sign. Same numbers here, of course. And so that's going to be our percent. So I'll add these same headers here. And we'll just clean this up a bit, and there we have that. Maybe make this blue if we so choose, Home tab, and we'll put the grid lines there. And so there's how we can work this out. Again, you just want to get used to making these tables. Now, if you can make these tables in Excel, you can make them by hand. They won't be as pretty, but the goal is to have this column and this column correct. And then as long as you can do that, you can do it by hand. You need to visualize the table and then you can write it by hand. that in order to do that, you need to make the table over and over and over again. It's a lot easier to make the table, visualize the table over and over and over again using Excel once you get good at it than by paper and pencil, and that's going to be a lot better for actual practice, meaning on-the-job practice work.